Good evening, everyone, and welcome. My name is Tico, and I help run event here at the Strand. Before we launch into a discussion of Caribou Adams' debut book, You Never Get It Back, I'd like to share a little bit of history about the Strand. The Strand was founded in 1927 by Benjamin Bass on 4th Avenue's Book Row. Stretching from Union Square to Astor Place, Book Row gradually dwindled from 48 bookstores until after 94 years, the Strand is the sole survivor, now run by third-generation owner Nancy Bass. We want to thank all of you for your support. Without our loyal community of book lovers and authors such as Cara and Elif, we wouldn't be here today. We are thrilled to have Caribou Adams with us for a discussion of her debut book, You Never Get It Back. Caribou Adams is the author of You Never Get It Back, winner of the John Simmons Short Fiction Award. Her stories appeared in many magazines, including Granta, The Kenyon Review, Epic, Alaska Quarter Review, and American Short Fiction. She has been awarded the Kenyon Review Short Fiction Prize, the Missouri Review Pendon Prize, the Marin Goff Prize in Fiction, along with the Center for Fiction Emerging Writers Fellowship and the support from the Breadloaf Writers Conference, the Sewanese Writers Conference, and the Virginia Center for the Creative Arts. Her essays, criticism, and interviews appear in The Believer, Tin House, and Plowshares, and an essay about co-editing the Southern Review appears in the Little magazine in Contemporary America. She is an associate professor of creative writing at Seton Hall University and lives in Brooklyn. Joining Cara in conversation is Elif Batuman. Elif Batuman's new novel, Either Or, is forthcoming with Penguin Press in May 2020. Her first novel, The Idiot, was a finalist for the Pulitzer Prize and was shortlisted for the Women's Prize for Fiction. She is the author of The Possessed, Adventures with Russian Books and People Who Read Them, a finalist for a National Book Critics Circle Award in Criticism, and the recipient of a Whiting Award, a Rana Jaffe Foundation Writers Award, and the Paris Review Terry Southern Prize for Humor. She has been a staff writer at The New Yorker since 2010 and holds a PhD in comparative literature from Stanford University. So without further ado, please join me in welcoming Cara and Elif to the stage.
Thank you everyone for coming. I'm so excited to be here with Cara for this phenomenal book. And I think Cara's going to start out by reading for us. And I'm just going to erase myself.
Thank you so much, Elif. Thank you to the Strand. And thank you all for coming. As Elif said, I'm going to start by reading just for about 2 minutes from one of the stories in my debut collection, You Never Get It Back. And the story I'm going to read from is called Never Gotten, Never Had. The book follows one character whose name is Kate Bishop. She's a young woman from New England. She grows up in Vermont in a working class family. And at this point in the book, she's moved to Arizona to get a PhD in the optical sciences. And the story that I'm going to read from concerns her relationship with her college roommate, Esme. We meet Esme at the beginning of the book. And in this story, Never Gotten, Never Had, which opens the second section of the book, Esme is coming to visit Kate in Arizona. And Esme is herself in a PhD program at Stanford, where she's studying English literature. Never gotten, never had. Esme is coming, and it can only be a mistake. She has left her graduate program, dissertation begun and abandoned, and now she is drifting around the country while her fiance completes an assignment in Rome. She met him at Stanford. The two things she tells me about him on the phone when she announces the news of their engagement and her plan to visit me are that he is taller than her, which even if she is wearing heels, which is not a hard thing to be, and suggests he is in fact short, and that he wants to go to business school, preferably to Wharton, after he finishes his PhD in computer science, which he is on track to do next year. They'll see at that point what their options are, she says, and I'm tempted to say, but don't. So the first person plural begins this early, huh? Her voice is triumphant, excited, and when I ask about her decision to give up on getting a doctorate herself, she says airily, oh, there are no jobs. But wouldn't you like the satisfaction of knowing you did it? Did something stupid? No. If you love it, it isn't stupid. I don't. You did. It's all archives and libraries. I wanted to read and travel, and I can do that without getting a useless degree. If I have to write one more grant application, I'll throw myself off a bridge, I swear to God. Not that you shouldn't finish yours. Science is different. It's practical. How long is she thinking of staying, I ask. What I don't say is that this is not a great time. Javier has moved in because he asked to 8 months into dating, and I stalled, and when he finally said it was obvious, I wasn't into it, meaning moving in, but maybe also our whole relationship. I felt panicked and bad and said, yes, of course I wanted to live together. I was just nervous about my landlord's reaction. And now here we are, two people sharing an apartment too small for the both of us, or rather too small for him and me and my doubts. Not long, she says, maybe 2 weeks. 2 weeks, I say, in what I hope is a neutral tone. We can go hiking, she says, and I can see this whole thing is doomed. I'll end there.
Oh my God, that's so wonderful. I was chortling away, but I had muted myself. And then I thought of unmuting myself mid-chortle, and then I thought this was gonna be creepy and weird, but that was fantastic. I love this book. I guess the first thing I want to talk about is the form, I guess, which is the thing that I just read the fantastic review in the New York Times, which everyone should read. And she starts out by talking about it could be a novel. The other thing is that, okay, yeah. So it feels like it's super classic, but it also feels really edgy at the same time. And it feels like you can feel that you wrote the stories over a period of time. And it kind of sounds like that. It kind of feels like that movie, Boyhood, where the guy shot it in real time. Because it feels like the issues, like there's more environment and Me Too stuff the later that you go. Because we talk about the evolution and how you thought about it, and whether the question of its relationship to a novel, it has any meaning to you at all. And yeah, that's it.
Yeah, I love I love that question, and I love the idea that it feels both classic and edgy. That's such a high compliment, because I love the classic short story form. I love writers like Juno Diaz, for example, where it's a very polished, very classic story that builds to a climax, and then there's something revealed and a kind of gentle falling off, and then everything is different at the end. But I also really love writers like Amy Hempel and Lydia Davis, who work in a slightly more experimental way, a more minimalist way that I think feels a little edgier and rawer. Even though it's also very polished and very considered. So I had a lot of influence.
And you do both of those, but you also have a third thing, which is this kind of cumulative snowballing thing, which I think is what makes people bring in the novel. Even though I know the story cycle is a thing, but I don't remember reading a story cycle that made me feel that as much as this. I don't know if there were some that you were thinking of. Maybe the Jennifer Egan one.
Yes. The Jennifer Egan, A Visit from the Goon Squad, is a book that does something like that. Olive Kittredge by Elizabeth Strout.
Oh, yeah.
I love it. It just got very moody and dark.
Yeah, sorry. It's a motion triggered. I can have a spasm and it should go on again, or not.
It looks kind of cool.
Okay. All right. I'm in spooky world now.
Speaking of edgy and dark, it actually looks kind of nice. So I was thinking about, I actually, I worked on these stories over many years, published, I think, around 20 stories before I put together a collection. And I really wanted the collection to hold together. I love the kind of collection that's just all the good stories I ever wrote and then some things I'm trying out. I think that's really great. And if there's one really good story in a collection, I feel like it's worth my time as a reader. But I wanted to work hard to give readers something that would make the book more than the sum of its parts. And so for me, that turned out to be character and this idea of character evolving through time. And so I actually started, my partner Cam likes to joke that my motto as a person is, why do it when you can overdo it?
I was just kind of thinking something along those lines. You're like, I love this thing, so I decided to do something much more challenging and more satisfying for the other person who's not me.
Exactly. So I ended up actually teaching a whole graduate class that I designed about the linked collection, starting with collections that are linked by voice but not by character, moving to those linked by character like Olive Kittredge, and then all the way through to books like Justin Torres's We the Animals, which started as a collection but grew into a novel. to try to ask myself what I wanted the book to look like. And so, yeah, I love Jesus' Son by Dennis Johnson, Olive Kittredge. There are a bunch of books that do this, actually. The more you start to look for them, the more you find them. But I think it is like two challenges at once, because you have to make viable stories, but then you have to turn them into a viable, longer project as well. So it was a fun challenge, but it took me a long time.
And was there, when you originally wrote the stories, were they all the same person? Like, was Kate Bishop always a person in your mind, or were the stories about different people and then you made them about her?
Some of the stories started out as being about different people, or people who could plausibly be different people. Sometimes they weren't named, various parts of their background weren't specified. And at some point I showed some friends who are writers a number of stories, and a couple said, yeah, just put these together, make it into a book. And then two people said, it could be really cool because some characters are kind of similar, to think about moving some closer together or further apart. And that's when I came up with her as a character. And then some of the other stories.
Oh, so cool.
In mind.
That's like Balzac, like when he wrote a bunch of novels and then he was like, I'm gonna make this the human comedy. And then he went and he changed a bunch of the, like the doctor's always the same doctor. He just made it like Dr. Brichot and all of them. It's like,
I didn't know that. I love knowing that.
Yeah, it's really cool. What was I gonna say? Oh my God, I had a question that was right here. The evolution of the story, the changing the names. Well, I don't know. Tell me about the optical sciences. How did you decide on the optical sciences?
That was like a terrifying decision to make, because I draw a lot on my life in this book, not always in terms of what literally has happened to me, but places I've lived, restaurants I've been to.
It's so clear that the places are real. Like then when you're reading it, you really start to want to know like what like where you were and whether you were a scientist. And but I was like, you've definitely been in those places, but yeah, I don't know about the rest.
I'm so glad. So that was terrifying because I'm not a scientist.
Oh yeah.
But I wanted that material to feel like as real and as observed as everything else did, and to make it feel seamless. So once I decided, okay, Kate Bishop is going to be a scientist initially, I realized I had to do some research. And I was kind of terrified by the decision. I went out to lunch with my friend Keelan Hughes, who's a writer, really brilliant Irish writer, poet and novelist, and her partner, Paul Behrens. And I was telling them, I need to learn about being an optical physicist, but I don't know who to ask about this. I feel kind of terrified because I need to know the things that aren't just like the stuff you can learn by reading. I need to know like what the physical space you would be working in would look like, and all that stuff that isn't typically captured unless it's captured in a novel or something like that.
That's so interesting. You're right. None of this stuff is captured unless it's in a novel. Yeah.
Yeah. I think it's fascinating, like what a novel or a poem or an essay can give us that other forms of writing cannot. And there's so much of the world that isn't captured in other forms.
Yeah. Just the daily experience of going there and like what a bench actually is. Yeah, it's so true.
Yeah. My partner is writing a historical novel, and so he's facing that problem with the past. There's just so much that you want to know about what it literally physically looked and felt like that can be kind of tough to access. So
even harder than with an optical physicist.
Right. My problem looks easy in comparison. But I told them this at lunch, and my friend Keelan, her partner Paul, was like, oh, actually, I used to be an optical physicist.
Oh, that's awesome. So you just have to know what you're looking for, and then you find it. That's like, yeah, that's really key.
It was it was just amazing. And he very kindly let me send him a list of my questions, and he wrote back with, answers to this information I couldn't have found otherwise. And then I wove that into the book.
Oh, cool. How did you decide on the field? Did it have to do with seeing and observing or?
In retrospect, it did. Or, once I started to think of Kate as a character, I love the idea that seeing and observing would be something that she does, as a scientist, but then also as a writer. And I think that's something that's always drawn me to science, intellectually, not literally in my life, but something I find fascinating about science. And I actually thought that vision could be an alternate title for the book. I toyed with that as
cool.
a title. Yeah.
I love this title though. It's so good. And it's so good that it's a quote, it's like a Hemingway quote. Like it really gets at that edgy classical line that you're treading.
Oh, I love that. And I love you also have taken titles.
Oh, yeah.
Which I love from other writers. And then,
Yeah, I like yours better, but thank you.
Oh, I love both of your titles. Well, all three of your titles.
Thank you.
But the other reason I chose optical science was because the University of Arizona, I wanted to set something there, and they have a really, really good program. And I thought it was so fascinating. It's a town, a city where there are light regulations because they have this really amazing.
Oh, wow.
So if you spend time in Tucson, you'll find it seems very, startlingly dark and unlit by natural light. And that's so scientists can observe the stars more clearly.
Oh, that's so cool. That's really, I remember that the lights being down in your book, and I was like, yeah, it's something that you would never know if you weren't there. And it really captures that, like the texture and the materiality of time and place that feels like another thing that you wouldn't know if you didn't happen to read a book that was set there, which is kind of unfortunate because then unlike an encyclopedia or something, it's not like all sorted like that. Like you can't just go and be like, oh, what's the sky like in Tucson? Let me read a novel that talks about that, or put interconnected story collection that talks about that. What I was curious about was the shift between first and third person and how those feel different to you and how you distributed them, and I don't know, yeah, how you feel about them.
That's a really fun question too. I love to think about perspective and something I don't get to talk about a lot. But first, to me, when I was initially writing, felt, I think, a little bit easier to do, in part because it's the voice, it's the perspective that we speak in typically when we tell a story. And there's something just really immediate about a first person narrator. But as I kind of developed as a writer, I wanted to learn to do a lot of different things. And you can see in the book, some stories are 30 pages, some are a single paragraph, some are fabulous, one's fabulous, the others are realist. Just really wanted to try everything out. And so I would give myself little assignments to try to do some different things that I didn't know how to do. And I tried writing in second person. None of those stories made it into the book, although one is addressed first. It's a first person.
Oh, yeah.
Or two actually are addressed first person narrators. And then I tried to learn about third. And at first, I found it very difficult to use third because it requires just a different set of skills in terms of managing psychic distance. But then I came to find that it's actually very versatile and flexible. And it lets you, unlike first, it lets you pull away from the character and then move closer to the character's mind and get as far or as intimate as you would like. And so I really started to have fun working with third person and got interested in trying that out. And then, I thought about trying to put all of the stories into first or third, but I felt like there's a reason I'd chosen those perspectives for each story. And I liked the very first story where we follow Kate is in third person. And I liked this effect of starting out with a little bit more distance from her and then moving into first. For me, it felt like a kind of dropping down into her perspective. And then there's another third person story that's from her mother's perspective. And that felt right because we have a little bit more distance from that character. And then there's one final third person story from Kate's perspective, which was initially the final story in the collection. So I thought I would start in third, move into first, and then end in third. And that would be a kind of elegant formulation. But like many of my writing plans, I came to find the writing had like a different thing in mind. And that wasn't really the end. And so then I experimented with writing a bit more after that third person story, The Most Common State of Matter, which is about Kate and a friend of hers named Josephine, after Kate has left the sciences and decided to try to be a writer. And I found the book wanted to continue just a little bit further. So hopefully that works for readers. It was a kind of organic process of feeling things out, I think.
So interesting. I don't want to spoil how do we feel about spoiling the plot or like the end? I'm really curious about the last story, about how you decided to, I guess I'll leave it up to you how much to say, but like how you decided to leave her at this sort of life juncture to bring her there and to end it there. I was really curious about that.
Yeah.
Oh yeah, there's a request to not spoil.
Okay, I think I can answer this without spoiling things. But where the book ends, I'll say two things. One is that initially I wasn't sure that kind of ending would be something that I could do in a way that I felt compelled by, that felt true enough and fresh enough to me as a writer.
It's a very kind of conventional, formal, novelistic and
exactly. And so initially anything that feels familiar, I move away from, because I want to defamiliarize things and do something new. But I also think there's something really beautiful and exciting about taking something other people have done and then reimagining it in some way. And so I came to sort of wonder, is that something I could do here effectively? Oh, I'm so glad it seems like it worked for someone. I'm really happy to hear that. And I looked at some of my favorite linked collections, my favorite books, including Olive Kittredge, including Jesus' Son, which is a very edgy, dark, challenging book. And I found that both of those ended actually with a moment of hope. It's also true of Leaving the Atocha Station by Ben Lerner, which of course is a novel, not a linked collection, but a book I also really love. And so I thought that's actually a move that sometimes really works for me. And so I think I leave the character, I'll just say, in a kind of hopeful moment in her life. And to me, that ended up feeling right for the character, right, I think, for the reader, after what it is that the sort of experiences you go through with her. And I hope also true to life.
So my favorite last paragraph.
Oh,
Aw.
Thank you. I won't say any more because I know some people haven't read it.
I love hearing you talk about this, and I love how much thought has gone, and I'm completely unsurprised by how much thought has gone into every element and into the crafting. And it's just a delight to hear you talk about, in part because it's just wonderful to hear that you can think so much about something and then it's actually good, because like the received wisdom that I grew up with is like, oh, don't overthink it, and like don't be too cerebral. But it's like this measuredness. Is that something that you think about like, are also trying to be like, I don't know, like, is that a consideration that you balance with like being like raw, or like, I don't even know what the opposite of thoughtful is, because it's so foreign to me.
Yeah, there was so much advice like that I got, I think, early in my career, that I had to sort of either reject or just work through and understand on my own terms before it made sense to me. And I think there's a difference between thinking deeply about something and trying to control it.
Oh, that's such a good point. This is a professor of creative writing, you guys.
I sometimes say to my students that, two things that you need for a good work of fiction are knowledge and heat. So you need to really
writing this down.
Care about the thing. I promise I won't turn this into a lecture, but it's helpful for me.
I'm here for the lecture.
And so I feel like the rawness or the urgency comes from like the heat part. You feeling it deeply, even if it's not something that's actually happened to you, right? It could be something totally imaginary, but you need to feel an emotional connection to it that feels urgent. And then you need knowledge, which doesn't mean, again, that it needs to happen, but you need to know through imagination, through experience, through research, through observation, how people work and how that world would work, what it would all feel like and be like. And so for me, there's a similar sort of dichotomy, between sort of thinking deeply but then moving sort of away from, right, trying to control the thing. So you need that other thing that kind of rises up that you can't control, that feels intuitive to come as well.
That's so interesting. I'm writing about the filmmaker Celine Sciamma now, and she talks of who did Portrait of a Lady on Fire, and she talks about her method, and it involves, but because she's French, she doesn't say emotional connection or caring or heat. She says desire. It's all about desire. So there's like the thing that you have to desire, and then there's all of the things that you need for the story to work, which is much more about the mechanics, and it's about like plotting them onto each other. And yeah, I love that idea of a balance, and like a very measured balance where you're like thinking about it and apportioning things. That's like very satisfying.
I can't wait to read that article about, I love reading about other artists and other types of artists.
And when you get someone who can actually talk about it like you can, it's so exciting. Yeah, I love it. It's my favorite thing. I think we're already getting some questions here. Should I be looking at these? Well, here's a wonderful comment from Audrey Moravsky. I lived for 12 years with a physicist who specialized in electroreflectance and the optical properties of solids. He had no interest in anything other than this and ice hockey. So I guess it's a data point for all of us. Thank you.
I wish I'd known you would have interviewed you and your partner.
There's two questions about process. One is about choosing the order of the stories, and the other is about the method of editing the final draft.
Yeah, so choosing the order of the stories, that again was a somewhat intuitive process. My partner, who's also a writer, at some point, he's looked at a number of drafts of this book, and at some point he said, well, what if you went just purely in chronological order? You know, right? There's something to be said for just going in a purely linear fashion. And I tried it and I read it through, and it just didn't feel right to me. And so I started to think of some of the stories that are about Kate's childhood as being, or that are set when she's a little bit younger than she is in the main thread of the book, as being like a little bit like backstory would be in a novel. And that was so helpful for me to think about right, the stories as stories on their own, but also functioning in this larger arc of the book, like front story or like backstory. And I did an interview recently with Bomb magazine with Madeline Lucas. It's a really wonderful, perceptive interviewer and writer. Her first novel is coming out soon. It's called Thirst for Salt, which I just love as a title. And she was saying that for her, reading the book had the effect that a friendship has, in that things are revealed as the book goes along.
Oh, yeah.
Like a greater intimacy. Does that make sense? Yeah. More is
well, and also in life, it's like different parts of your past are more or less relevant. Like I never thought about my childhood in my 20s, and like now I constantly think about it. Yeah.
Exactly, right.
That
Different
totally makes sense.
feel more present or more distant when you're at different ages or different places in your life. Yeah. Yeah.
I love the idea of that mapping into the order.
Yeah. Yeah. So that ended up sort of giving the book its shape. I decided I wanted to start on New Year's Eve, 1999. It just seemed like a fun time to start. You know, it's about to be a new millennium. New Year's Eve, just the promise of a party and something changing and beginning. And that's when Kate has just finished college. And so it felt like just a good moment in her life to kind of begin that arc into her early 30s. And then there's a little story that begins the book that's a fabulous story called I Met Lost the Other Day. And I thought about whether to keep that in or take it out. It's not like the other stories, but it sets up, I think, some of the themes I was most interested in terms of longing and loss and creating something out of what's gone. And so ultimately I decided it would function sort of like a prologue to the book. And then what was the other question? It was about process as well, about editing.
It was about it was about the final draft. How do you edit the final draft? I mean, that seems kind of similar.
Yeah, That's an interesting question because a lot of the stories were written and published before it became a book.
Oh, did you change them? Did you go back and make changes?
Some I went back and changed because they weren't always about Kate Bishop and their even in their final published
Oh,
form.
wow, interesting.
And that was kind of fun. It felt like a little subversive to take a story that had been published and go back and start to rework it. I'm sure if my agent was to hear that, she would weep with despair. I keep threatening to, to go back to older work and, you know, reimagine it late in life, like Henry James or
Oh,
something.
I've had that when the agent is like, you need to move away from this.
Right. You're
I've
done.
heard that,
Oh,
yeah.
shit, let go of that book. There are writers who want to publish everything quickly, and then there are writers like me who just don't want to let go of the thing and want to keep reimagining it.
Because it feels like part of the compulsion to go and rework stuff is like once the artifact exists, you can think differently about its existing, and that creates its own story and it changes the story. So yeah.
Yeah, that's interesting. So Kate, you know, becomes a writer. She's trying to do that toward the end of the book. I don't think it gives too much away to say that. And, you know, I think that the sort of a number of writers have done this. They've had characters who are writers who turn out at the end of the book to be writing the very book that we have been reading. I think that can be a fun and satisfying move. But to me, it felt like a little too, it felt like it would have felt a little too forced or a little too neat for my book to make that explicit and to say what you're holding is the book that Kate wrote. But, you know, I wanted to leave that possibility as one that could exist in the reader's mind, certainly. But what I really wanted to leave readers with was a sense of like, this is Kate's life, and this is what it will be animating whatever it is that she does write.
That's so interesting. This now reminds me, so one of the famous books that ends with the person having written the book that you're holding in your hands is Proust in Search of Lost Time. But when I was, my Proust professor in grad school, he had this theory, which was, which is actually really well documented. His name is Josh Landy, that it's not the same book. And he goes and shows different, at the end when he talks about the books that he's going to write, it's like various things are different from the book. And there's something that feels very kind of like energizing about it not being the same, because if it's the same, the writer has sort of written themselves into a corner. Like there's something nice about feeling that there's room for the writer to sort of escape, while also ringing that bell of recursiveness and reflexivity that's also pleasant. I think that's a cool balance to strike.
Yeah, and there's also, I mean, one thing that I love about a novel or a story collection is you have this sense often, right, that the characters like being more honest with you than they could ever be with any other person. Because you have access to their mind, their sensory experiences, and then they're confessing things. And it's such an interesting tension because reading a book, you're reading something that's sculpted, that's created, that's a formal creation, but it also gives you that sense of intimacy and closeness. And so if you then at the end say, well, this was all written, it's a move back toward that sort of formal act of creation done by the artist to present to an audience, as opposed to just a mind showing you.
Oh, totally. That's a beautiful point. Yeah. Yeah. So yeah, you feel like you're getting more. Yeah. I love that. Here is a question about, is there any, from Talia, is there any interest in writing another collection in purely second person? It's such an interesting point of view to read.
Oh, interesting.
You're like, hell no.
Well, one of my problems as a writer is that I always have like 15 book projects in mind that I think would be cool to do.
I want to talk about that. I want to talk about your next project, but yeah, first, second person.
So now I'm getting excited about this idea. I'm thinking, well, no, I didn't have that idea in mind, but now that you suggest it, formal challenge. And I love Lori Moore. She's someone who's very influential for me, especially at the start of my life as a writer and just a reader, actually. Read her, I think, in high school and just totally fell for her. Just found everything I could and read it. And she handles second person so beautifully, as does Julie Oranger, who's another writer I really love.
Oh yeah, she's wonderful too.
Yeah, she's got one story written in second person in How to Breathe Underwater, which I think is just great. So yeah, that's like a very fun form to work in. So no plans at present, but I'm definitely not ruling it out.
So I think we were talking about this before. You're working on both a lyrical essay collection and I already forgot, was it a novel?
Exactly.
A novel about immigration.
Yeah.
So why don't you, could you, so I'm really curious that you already have the kind of genre, I don't know what genre, incorporating story novel collection. And then I was really excited to hear that you're also doing lyrical essays, which is also feels a little bit hybrid, and a novel at the same time. And I guess I'm curious about, I don't know what it's like to change between the different genres and how you decide and how it shapes your thinking to be working in the different modes.
Yeah, and of course you do that yourself. You write fiction and also nonfiction.
Yeah, it makes me crazy. So I want to know about other people.
I also really love and find hybrid genre stuff fascinating. And I don't like to make anything easy on myself. And so my partner is like, couldn't you just like figure out how to do one thing and then do it? Like write a certain kind of story, or write a novel. And instead you're always, kind of wanting to challenge yourself and work in different forms. But for me, that's just exhilarating. It takes a long time. And I think each genre has things to teach that are unique.
Totally, yeah.
I love novels written by poets. That's like one of my favorite things. Garth
cool.
Ben Lerner. I'm really excited for Sarah Manguso's debut novel.
Oh, totally.
Beautiful.
That's interesting. I never thought of grouping them that way, but novels written by poets. Yeah, they're always really good.
Yeah, because they're attuned to musicality and to language and the sentence. And then also
Patricia Lockwood.
I love that book. And then I think they just approach fiction in like a slightly different way. And so some of the more familiar moves they tend not to make. It's really exciting. So I also teach a graduate class on hybrid forms, advanced undergrad, grad class. And we read, Claudia Rankine, we read Sarah Manguso. And I love to read, for example, Two Kinds of Decay, Sarah Manguso's memoir about her illness when she was a student at Harvard, and to ask them in what way it seems to borrow from poetry and then also from the short story form as she's writing a memoir. So I guess thinking about those things led me to wanting to try both a novel and then also a book-length lyric essay. And so the book-length lyric essay is a project that kind of came out of my anxiety about climate change. About 5 years ago, I started to feel, I was reading the science and just really feeling the weight of what we knew, but the world and the political world certainly didn't seem to be reacting to yet. And
I feel like we feel it and you never get it back, kind of coming in the end with the Florida project.
Oh yeah, it was definitely, definitely present as I was writing some of those stories too.
Yeah.
And it was such a weird moment in the culture, I think, because a lot of us kind of knew what was happening.
Yeah, for ages, but it wasn't a big deal somehow, or it was a big deal, but it wasn't, I don't know, yeah.
Yeah, the culture wasn't like the needle wasn't registering it yet somehow. That changed recently, and it feels like all of a sudden the needle went from like, sort of like here to like here.
Yeah, totally.
Even though the data,
it feels like younger people, it feels like the super young people suddenly came in and were like, wait, like the people our age are all just like, oh yeah, we all know that it's this horrible thing. And the young people were like, what the like, how are we all sitting here? And we were like, oh yeah.
Yeah, exactly. So I hit that moment like 5 years ago, and it felt like I didn't know who to talk to about it, because you can't really just bust out with that at a party. Just like, so is anyone like grappling with the fact?
I mean,
that
some people do, but yeah, it doesn't do good things for the party. So yeah, better they should all write a lyrical book-length essay.
Yeah, that's maybe my Vermont, New England background. Like reserve, you're not allowed to just come out with that at a party. You have to do something else with it. But so as a way of like grounding myself,
Mhm.
I started just twice a week, Wednesdays and Saturdays, I think were the days I chose. I would go outside and stand in the weather and just observe the weather in the natural world and describe it. And I thought of it in part as sort of like writing like a little love letter to the world as it was in that moment, knowing it was going to change, but wanting to be able to give it to someone in the future and say, even if there isn't snow in Vermont anymore in December, you can know a little bit about what it was like. I know, I know. But you know, I did some thinking as well about how the world is always changing. Nothing is ever the same as it was. This is obviously a much bigger and more existential change. It's a different relationship, the Anthropocene, when we can actually affect weather and nature. That involves huge, you know, sort of very large scale rethinking about our place in the world. But at the same time, change is also inevitable. Time passes, nothing stays the same. None of us stay here forever. And so for me, there was something just important about recording and observing. And there's also that idea that attention is sort of like devotion. And I think to want to save the world, to want to save the natural world, we need to pay attention to it. We need to see it first. So that was where that project came from.
There's a lot of, I mean, are you into meditation? Do you have like a spiritual practice, which is such a horrible phrase, but has that been something that's changed for you in the past years? Or is the embracing of change something that you are able to do without? For me, I was not able to do it without, you know, an app on the phone that says, pay attention to the constant change and flux of nature. And I'm like, okay. But yeah.
It's so funny. There's an app that gives you quotations that have to do with mortality. And I talked to one of my classes about this, and some of the students were like, why would you want that? And I thought, like, I was on the opposite side of the spectrum. I was like, I don't need an app because I think about that every day. How do you ever not think about that?
Have you always been like that?
I think so. I think so. My partner and I got married a couple of years ago, and we had a Quaker ceremony. We're not Quaker, but I've always liked that tradition and the idea of sitting in silence with other people and seeing what arises. And so we did that, and friends shared and family shared just all sorts of really interesting things about memories about each of us, or thoughts about themselves and their own relationships. And one of my aunts told a story about a time she was driving me somewhere, and I was in the backseat of the car. I was like 2 or 3, and I put a blanket over my head and was just silent. And she got worried after a while and asked what was going on in the back seat. And I said, I'm thinking. And I guess I just needed like a quiet enclosed space within the car to think. So I do think
wow, that's an incredible story. Wow. And I love how you describe the Quaker meeting too, because it's kind of like an example of what you were talking about before, where it's this synthesis of like a lot of thought and specificity and deep, like a lot of thoughtfulness and consideredness, along with a complete letting go of control and being like, the ceremony is just going to be like what happens. And of course that's going to involve change and be weather like in a way. Yeah, I love that.
Yeah, that tension between the structure, the container, the form, and then the wild thing that happens.
There's a question here about whether the pandemic changed any of your writing or recording methods.
That's a great question. I know the pandemic now is like, for a while it was like this little period in our life, and now it's like a year and a half coming.
Yeah, it's just reality now. Yeah.
Yeah. I've been writing some essays that are, you know, I read Donald Antrim's memoir and essays, The Afterlife, which is one of my favorite books of the past 20 years. It's funny and heartbreaking and really, you know, reveals character in such interesting ways. It's about his relationship with his mother, who was kind of a free spirit and also had a drinking problem. And it's about his life as a writer and artist in New York City. And so I started, I think, in part because I was loving those essays. There's certain writers who make me want to write in response. There's some writers who make me feel like I could never do that, and I feel like I want to be quiet and just sit with their work. And then there are other writers who make me want to respond, and he has that second impact on me. And so I started writing these personal essays, which isn't something I'd done much of before. I don't know if that has to do with the pandemic or just having finished this one book project and letting myself just try out some new things. What about for you, Elif? Has it changed your writing or recording practices?
Has it changed writing or recording practices? I mean, no, I was in a pandemic of my head, so I haven't noticed a real change. But what you just said, I love what you just said about some books that, and it's almost independent. It's like another metric besides whether you like it or not, is the ones that make you want to write immediately. And that's actually a question from Barry. What kinds of books inspired you while you wrote your stories? And sort of more, so you've talked a lot about the different, what do you call it, points of reference and touchstones for you. But I'm also curious about what books do you read to just get yourself feeling like writing?
Yeah, for me, another writer who's influential was Juno Diaz. And he's a writer who, when I first read Drown, I read it in hardcover right after it came out. And I just never read a writer like him before. The voice just felt so real and specific to me. And he was also writing out of, an experience of being working class. I hadn't read many stories about before. And for whatever reason, his voice on the page made me want to respond. And he's someone who's always been generative for me. He's so unsparing and unafraid of being really honest. There's, a story in which like a character's brother dies of cancer. And the story ends with him remembering his brother throwing like a bike lock or something at him hard enough that it could have really seriously injured him, this act of cruelty. And so as much as he loves the brother, he also knows that the brother could be really cruel and isn't afraid to kind of end the story with a moment like that, which I just really respect. So he's certainly someone who makes me want to write. I'm trying to think.
The class thing is interesting because it's there in your book too. It's like it's the class dynamic.
The class thing, yeah, absolutely, yeah. Which wasn't something I thought about so much for a number of years. And then when I looked at the stories together, I thought, oh, of course, that's important to my own experience in the world. Of course, it's something I'm interested in. Of course, it's part of the stories. And Esme was a fun character because she comes from an upper middle class family. Kate does not. And the writer Charles Baxter talks about counterpointed characterization. So we often talk about having tension or conflict between characters, but he says a more nuanced way to think about it is counterpointing, putting two things next to each other and seeing what that reveals. And more nuanced things can show up than just tension or conflict. And so Kate and Esme to me became two characters who it was fun to put in the same frame because they could counterpoint each other. But I love to read poetry.
I love her. She's a fantastic character.
Oh,
just some Esme fangirling here.
She was so fun to write. I love how much agency she feels, how unselfconscious she is.
Wouldn't you feel satisfied to do something stupid? No.
I know. She's decided it's so it's stupid.
There is a request here for writing tips that you can share that you teach to your students.
Yeah, definitely. Do you have 15 hours? I can give you just a few. I love teaching writing. For me, it's like teaching, just like writing, is sort of an endless process of experimentation and discovery. It's still so cool to me that I get these hours with people in a room and we can do just anything I can think up that I think would be helpful or generative. So one, it sounds very basic.
Sorry, does it help with your writing? Because most people talk about teaching as kind of like something that sucks energy out. Are you able to find it generative?
I think any job takes
Yeah,
time and energy. So
it does both. Yeah.
I mean, the thing about teaching that is
Yeah.
unique is that it's a performance among other things.
Mhm.
And I do find the physicality of talking to a room. I have a soft voice. I'm not a big person. So trying to be interesting and engaging is sort of physically exhausting sometimes. But getting together in a room with people and spending our time paying close attention to writing that I love, and then to writing that's being created that we're watching come into being in front of us,
Mhm.
that to me is magical and is helpful,
Mhm.
I think. I was an editor for a number of years. I found that helpful in a different way, but yeah, teaching is special. So one
Sorry, I
super,
interrupted you from your tips. Yeah.
I don't know if this is a tip, but it's an exercise. Sometimes with like a introduction to fiction class, I do this exercise, but I actually think it can be good any stage in your life as a writer. It's super easy just to sit down and write down the first 10 memories that come into your mind, being as specific and sensory as you can. And I think often the things that arrive surprise you, and
So
they might
interesting.
become a story, but they might also just show you something about your interest in the world or your experience that might lead you in a sort of interesting direction. So that's an exercise. I love the books, A Poetry Handbook by Mary Oliver. You can read it in an afternoon, beautifully written, so wise. It's about poetry, but it's helpful as a fiction writer or an essayist, whoever you are, it's helpful. She talks about everything from sound to the process of writing to the role of having created something that's read by other people in the world. And she does it in like, 90 pages. It's like this very slim, beautiful book. So that book I find just so helpful. And I think just asking yourself too, do I care about this? Is this the most urgent and true thing I can say? True, not in a literal way, but in an emotional or intellectual, in a felt way. That for me is helpful.
Yeah, so much of it seems like it's about like writing down the memories. There's like, I don't know, a part of me is like, oh, why would I bother doing that? I already know what those memories are going to be. And of course that's wrong. Like, of course I don't know what the memories are going to be. And that's the whole point of doing the exercise. It's like to trick you. I feel like that so much of writing is like, you're like, oh, of course I know what I'm going to say. And then you start to write it and the steps between, it's like a dream, like the steps are all unclear. And that is where like the discovery happens. And it must be about trying to jumpstart that process in some way.
Yeah, absolutely. I know. I'm still always surprised by that too. I'll sometimes think, oh, I know what I would do here if I was to do this exercise, and then I'll do it and it will just totally startle me.
Yeah. Oh, that's wonderful. I wonder if we should, if there's no more questions, we're pretty much at the end. Should we wrap this up?
Yeah, I think this makes sense as a place perhaps to.
I love that. There was a question about hybrid genre books you would recommend, but you gave us so many recommendations already, unless there's some more you want to leave us with.
I can recommend a few more since we've got like 90 seconds. I love Solmaz Sharif's book, Look, which is.
Oh, there's a request to repeat the Mary Oliver title.
Oh yeah, the Mary Oliver book is called A Poetry Handbook.
Poetry Handbook.
Title. So it sounds descriptive, but that's actually the title of the book. Has a yellow cover. It's beautiful and small. I also just love the physical object. I own like 5 of them because I keep misplacing them and then I buy a new copy. So hybrid genre works. Solmaz Sharif has this book called Look, which it's a book of poetry, but it's all about one topic. It's a kind of project book that's about the war in Iraq, the war on terror. It's also about the Iran-Iraq war and her family's history with that. And she takes terms from the Department of Defense dictionary and gives us definitions from that dictionary and then reimagines them. So,
oh, brilliant.
Yeah, so smart, so brilliant, really moving.
Smart, yeah.
the first poem, just called Look, it's the title poem. That to me is just a poem that deserves to be, remembered forever. It's just really incredible. So that's one other kind of hybrid work that I would recommend.
And the other hybrid work everyone should read is Cara's incredible book, which is, there are links to buy here in the chat window. You never get it back. Everyone has to read this book. And this has been such a fun conversation.
This has been
I love talking to you.
Thank you so much, Elif.
Thank you so much for Cara and Ellis for being here with us tonight. Thank you to everyone that attended the event. As Ellis said, we do have links to Cara's book in the chat below. They are going to be signed. So if you want to purchase a copy, please click on the link. And thank you all and have a good night.
Whoops. I sent a message that I meant to be to everyone, but I did not send it to everyone.
Yes. Thank you, everyone.
Okay.
Thanks so much, everybody.
Have a good night. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Good night.
Good night.
Good night.